Welcome once again. And as you know, today is International Women's Day, с праздником. And especially on this occasion, we're delighted to be able to host our speaker, Muireann Maguire from the University of Exeter, whose title is Hitherto, Unheard of and Awful, Literary Breastfeeding and Maternal Agency in 19th Century Russian Novels. And our собеседник will be Christine Warbeck from Northern Illinois University. So thank you, Muireann.
Thank you very much, Anne, for the introduction. And welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming along this lunchtime or this evening, depending on where you are. And I'm really honored to have been invited by Sarah and others to speak to this group on International Women's Day. And I'm also very excited that my theme is nothing other than what has been known as the most womanly art of breastfeeding. And today I'm going to talk about how, in the context of 19th century Russian literature, breastfeeding narrative can prove revelatory about the potential and the limitations for feminine and maternal agency at that point in time. So this talk is based on an article which is forthcoming soon from our subject journal, Russian Review. And if any of the anonymous external readers are in the audience today, thank you very sincerely for your input, which was fantastic. So I thought it might be helpful, just before I start, to show you the structure that I intend to follow. So as you can see, I'm going to begin by talking you through scholarship on breastfeeding narrative in literature generally, and not just in the Russian field. I then move quickly through 3 different samples of breastfeeding narrative from non-Russian, late 18th century or 19th century breastfeeding narrative, just to show you what literary critics do typically try to demonstrate from breastfeeding narrative. In the next section, I'm going to round up the usual suspects for a quick overview of Russian breastfeeding narrative. Tolstoy, always the fall guy for gender analysis in Russian literature, and Korolenko, who is possibly a less predictable choice, but who happens to have authored a short story with an extremely pertinent passage for today's theme. And finally, I move to case studies of 2 comparatively obscure 19th century texts by much lesser known authors. My reading of historical novelist Ivan Lazhechnikov's 1859 novella, My Doctor's Grimace, interprets breast milk as a symbol of female instability, but also of autonomy and self-expression. The titular doctor's efforts to suppress both lactation and female agency do not end well for anyone involved. In my second example, the now forgotten popular author Mikhail Voskresenskii's 4-part novel, Natasha Podgorich, from 1858, conversely, demonstrates how wet nursing allows a young woman to gain agency and thus temporarily to escape male control. And I want to make 2 points very quickly here. First of all, today's study of breastfeeding narrative is an offshoot of a much larger ongoing project on maternal writing within Russian literature. I'm specifically interested in how male authors write about maternal experience and why they do so. Partly because of this other project, I've focalized my talk today from the perspective of male author texts. But also, I'm not particularly aware of 19th century breastfeeding narrative by Russian women writers. If anyone here can suggest examples of the latter, please do share at the end or contact me by email. You should be able to see my contact details on the slides. Second, nothing that I'm going to tell you tonight about scholarship or its conclusions regarding breastfeeding narrative is original in this particular literary field. All my points about maternal agency, female self-expression, and even about the structural violence exerted on mothers when husbands, relatives, or social expectations inhibit maternal breastfeeding, all of these points have been made before in the context of other world literatures, starting with the great Cixous, who originated the analogy of écriture féminine as white ink, a literature which shares the same spring of spontaneous maternal creativity as breast milk. This sort of scholarship, unfortunately, rarely gets published by mainstream academic publishers. Much of it appears only in article format, or what monographs that do appear tend to come from smaller feminist presses such as Demeter. In other words, it's marginalized. The scholarship of gender is itself gendered, and it can be relatively hard to get hold of. In the Russian context, it barely exists, although this is changing rapidly. So the only barely original thing that I have done is to introduce the analysis of breastfeeding narrative to the Russian context, although even in this, as you're about to see, I have my precursors. So I've included this next slide to give you an idea of what is happening in the world of literary breastfeeding scholarship. And as you can see, the monographs are actually quite recent, showing that this is a growing field. B.J. Woodstein, a Swedish-English scholar, has recently brought out The Portrayal of Breastfeeding in Literature, which aims to answer questions such as, how are breasts and breastfeeding shown in literature? Why does the depiction of breastfeeding in literature matter? What messages do we get from literature about the feeding of infants and about women's bodies? Does this differ between cultures? And so on. As you'll see, I'm going to pick up some of the same questions in my analysis. Woodstein's perspective is sociological as well as literary. She takes time in her book to contrast reading habits in Britain and Sweden. In spite of this sociological angle, her study is useful for literary scholars as an overview of breastfeeding narrative in contemporary Swedish and British fiction. Familiar names will include novels by Maggie O'Farrell, Kate Atkinson, and even Philip Pullman. I'm less familiar with Lisa Algazi Marcus's book, Mother's Milk and Male Fantasy in 19th Century French Narrative, because I don't know the field as well. But it's very important for scholars of Russian 19th century literature to be aware of whatever was going on in France, as we all know. So this is an interesting book about the alternate politicization and eroticization, again, by male authors and mostly male artists, of the mother-child breastfeeding dyad. As for Russian-specific sources, they tend to be largely in the historical and sociological fields. And in the research for today's paper, I was immensely helped by articles by Eve Levin, David L. Ransell, and other contributors to the wonderful book, Russia's Women, Accommodation, Resistance, and Transformation. I was actually aware of, but I returned to Anna Cuxhausen's really important monograph, From the Womb to the Body Politic, which is an important resource for the relationship between maternal behavior and political ideology in late 18th century Russia. And it dwells, of course, on the ever-sensitive question of whether babies should be breastfed by their mothers, or whether it's a better idea to send them to wet nurses or even to orphanages. And I can't pass by without mentioning Natalia Pushkaryova, who has more or less single-handedly invented within Russia and the former Soviet region more generally, the entire discipline of maternal studies, particularly within history. She doesn't focus on literary representations of maternity or breastfeeding, but she has edited various collections in which such studies do appear. And when it comes to literary scholarship, much of it is in the form of still unpublished PhD dissertations, such as Rosemary Finlanson's recent Cambridge dissertation, not on my slide, which is about the gendering of medieval Russian bodies. The PhD dissertations have the advantage of being generally available open access, and the disadvantage of not being as well known as they deserve, especially if the author doesn't go on to publish them as a book. Perhaps, a standout for me here is Aura Young's 2019 PhD, which is the first work that I'm aware of to focus on breastfeeding in Tolstoy. And I found it really useful, and I recommend it if you want to follow up in the Tolstoyan context some ideas that I'm just going to dance around in today's talk. And another important resource, not specifically about breastfeeding, but simply for addressing maternal narrative in 19th century and also 20th century Russian writing, is Jenny Kamener's Women with a Thirst for Destruction, the Bad Mother in Russian literature. And transgressive maternal behavior is also a theme of Serenity Stanton-Orengo's recently awarded PhD from the University of Illinois. And I think I saw that Serenity's in the audience today, so belated congratulations to her. And in terms of arguably analogous research as a way of developing female autonomy, I was inspired or encouraged by Colleen Lucy's recent monograph, Love for Sale, representing prostitution in imperial Russia. So you can see from all these titles and from their relatively recent appearance that there is a new trend in 19th century and also later Russian literary studies of turning towards gender and looking at different trends and analyzing social developments. But it's gathering speed slowly but surely. And if I ever finish writing my book, hopefully I will get to contribute to it. Moving on to my next slide. So I'm not going to go into any detail about the three texts listed here for time reasons, but I want to begin with the earliest, Pamela, or rather Volume 2 of Pamela by the British author and originator of the modern novel, Samuel Richardson. So you may be familiar with the first volume of Pamela as a very drawn-out story of a young woman, a maid, who's trying to defend her virtue from her libidinous employer. She marries him. And the second book or volume, which is less well known and which came out the following year, deals with how their relationship, now that it's been legalized, transpires. Pamela has a baby. She wants to breastfeed it. Her husband really doesn't want to breastfeed it because he wants to resume conjugal relations. And it's assumed that this is impossible when a woman is breastfeeding. There's quite a long debate which has been the subject of several academic articles. And we can use the second volume of Richardson's Pamela to learn what 18th century authors were thinking and how they were satirizing the sexuality within a marriage and who had the right to determine sexual behavior within a given upper middle class marriage at that time. The woman's sentimental attachment to breastfeeding and the husband's pragmatic resistance to it is a very useful way into this particular very fraught debate. My second example is by an Irish author, Maria Edgeworth. Ennui is not her best known novel. She's far better known for Castle Rackrent, about badly behaved landlords. Ennui is the story of an Irish wet nurse from a remote and backward Irish village who is employed to feed the son of the British family who have taken over that particular land in that particular part of Ireland. It's a colonial story, clearly. Where the story takes an interesting twist is that the wet nurse decides to swap the children in her care. That is, she swaps her own child, her blood descendant, for the child that she has been asked to breastfeed. So the two little boys exchange fates. The Irish peasant grows up to inherit the estate, while the boy who is aristocratic Briton by birth grows up in the bosom of an Irish peasant family. Edgeworth uses this narrative to play with cultural stereotypes about what it means to be Irish, what it means to be British, who is really backward, and so forth. But it's also a very intriguing analysis of the power, the hidden power of a wet nurse, in that she can carry out these substitutions. My final example is by the French author Guy de Maupassant, and his short story, The Idyll, describes an unusual exchange where a wet nurse who was traveling in a train carriage with an unemployed man who was about to pass out from starvation notices the situation that he is in and allows him to drink from her breasts. Again, it's a story that has been widely studied, and it's, I mentioned previously how many scholars look at the eroticization of breastfeeding, which is a theme throughout history dating back to the classical antiquity. In the Idyll, we have a rare example of breastfeeding being de-eroticized. It becomes a gesture of pure pragmatic kindness on the part of the wet nurse who is able to help the man in this way. And again, it raises interesting questions about what breasts are for and in how many different ways a lactating mother, or indeed a lactating woman, can be useful within society. I've used as an illustration a picture which I love. I have a print in my office, but that's not the only reason for including a visit to the child at nurse. I'm motivated to include this picture because it shows a mother luxuriously dressed, visiting with her oldest child in tow, her youngest, who is staying with a rather more modestly dressed but still very tidy wet nurse. If you look at the scene, you can pick up on the tension underneath, which ties into the underlying problems between mothers and wet nurses in affluent European society. The child is attached physically and apparently emotionally to the wet nurse. It's looking at its mother as if to say, "Who are you? Someone take this strange lady away." It's the somewhat shabby children arranged around the wet nurse who appear to be happy and relaxed, whereas the child who is now old enough to live with her mother, although beautifully dressed, appears stiff and uncomfortable, almost like a doll. And the same can be said of the mother. So the wet nurse appears to have substituted herself into the child's affections, replacing the mother. And I'll be returning to this theme of the wet nurse and her mysterious powers later in this paper. But the wet nurse is also the theme which holds together these three examples. By this time, you are probably thinking of many more potential examples along these lines. If you've read Toni Morrison's Beloved, it may be springing to mind as yet another instance of how breastfeeding as a function is inflected by the enslavement of nursing mothers. And then again, there's a wonderful story about the exploitation of wet nurses by the Bengali writer Mahaswati Devi, and so on. But I'm going to tug us firmly back to the 19th century. I think I've given enough examples here to show the variety and the depth of breastfeeding narrative as a source of symbolism for a wide spectrum of issues, which include maternal agency, the subject of today's talk, but which actually go beyond this into other social problems, from post-colonial tensions to class differences between affluent parents and much poorer wet nurses. So turning now to the Russian context, I'm going to look successively, hopefully successfully as well, at breastfeeding narrative and maternal agency in Tolstoy and Korolenko before turning to my final case studies of Lazhechnikov and Voskresenskii. So, writing during the second half of the 19th century, fiction by Leo Tolstoy and Vladimir Korolenko tends to show how maternal breastfeeding can be used to define correct feminine behavior. This is particularly true of Tolstoy, whose personal attitude to maternal breastfeeding was conflicted and itself a source of conflict in his life, as you'll know if you're familiar with his biography and the actions of his wife. In War and Peace, he represents breastfeeding as a form of independence and self-expression for the heroine, Natasha Rostova. After she delivers her first child, her mother-in-law and her spouse Pierre well-meaningly discourage her from nursing the infant. This is an example of very soft form of what has been called structural violence. In other words, it's pressure exerted structurally through social expectations within a culture that, similarly to 19th century France, did not endorse maternal breastfeeding among high-status families. insistence on maternal breastfeeding was considered, frankly, eccentric. Even when Émile Rousseau famously encouraged French mothers to breastfeed their own children, while this generated a lot of media attention, statistics show that it was largely ignored. There was a brief fashion for breastfeeding, but it did not discourage mothers who could afford it from sending their children out to nurse. However, Tolstoy, who had read his Rousseau, has Natasha push back hard against well-meaning family advice. In this passage, I've put the crucial bit in bold. With her next child, in spite of protests from her mother, her doctors, and her husband himself, who all protested against her feeding as if against a hitherto unheard of and harmful thing, she got her own way, and ever afterwards fed all her children herself. You have picked up the title for my talk in there. The final sentence forms the title in a slightly different translation of Ora Young's PhD thesis. But I want to focus on that line, she got her own way. Breastfeeding allows Natasha to win. It allows her to assert her independence, her autonomy. But it's not as if she's winning an empty battle. Tolstoy is assuming, and this in itself becomes a form of structural violence, that any normal woman wants to breastfeed. And this does seem a little oppressive by today's standards. We can accept that a woman has a right to breastfeed, but also that she has a right to not breastfeed. Tolstoy has a problem with the second part of that. He assumes that any normal woman would want to breastfeed, and that's why Anna Karenina's Kitty, a decade later, after Tolstoy and his wife had had a lot more children, has a more positive experience from the start, with her mothers and sister offering her advice on how to breastfeed. Half a century has passed, after all, between the fictional worlds of the two novels, and fashions in breastfeeding, as in other things, have changed. But Anna herself, by handing her daughter with Vronsky over to a wet nurse, shows herself up as a failed mother. She can't bond with her child. She's not interested in her. She admits that she doesn't love her. Anna's failure as a mother, second time round, foreshadows the failure of her relationship with Vronsky and ultimately her death. Ironically enough, by opting not to breastfeed her second child, Anna is actually obeying social expectations, even though we know from her often rebellious and even flamboyant behavior that she is very capable of defying society's strictures if she wants to. Anna is arguably killed off not by the social isolation she endures, but by Tolstoy's disapproval of her as a mother. My next slide is a series of extracts from chapter 28, part 7 of Anna Karenina in Rosamund Bartlett's translation. The action takes place on the day that Anna decides to kill herself and does so. But before she makes that fateful visit to the train station, she goes to see Dolly in order to tell Dolly everything she's feeling. But this goes badly wrong, as you can see from the passage. Anna's egotism and negativity is strongly contrasted with the innocence and goodness of the sisters Dolly and Kitty. When Anna arrives, she interrupts, of all things, a consultation about breastfeeding, or as Tolstoy puts it, совещание о кормлении. And as you can see, I won't read this slide aloud, but as you can see, the other women talk about breastfeeding, they give each other advice, they talk about the baby. But Anna doesn't get involved. Anna isn't interested. She cannot contribute. So this shows in Tolstoyan terms that because Anna can't or decides not to breastfeed, because she withdraws from the arena of happy maternal care, she is not a proper woman and she must die. The next story, On a Cloudy Day, by Vladimir Korolenko, relies on a mixture of social history and melodrama to showcase, this time very overt, structural violence against a breastfeeding woman. Korolenko describes the historical, although almost certainly quite rare, Russian custom of compelling serf women to breastfeed their owners' pedigree hound puppies. You may not want to, but if you look very closely at that illustration by Nikolai Kasatkin, you'll see some tiny puppies in the box. In this story, there is a serf woman called Anna who has recently had a child and who is being forced to suckle hound puppies in this way. When her husband, also a serf, Alexei, comes home and discovers the situation, he kills the puppies. From his point of view, the natural order of things has been upset. And as he says, where is the law? The child is crying in the cradle while the pups are sucking the woman's breast. Even if the child is a peasant's son, he still has a human soul in the sight of God. And that he should lie in the cradle while you, meaning the master, foul a woman's bosom with curs. And here he just trails off because he finds the whole situation too unspeakable. The latter, however, the landlord, viewing Alexei's actions against the pups as murder, takes the opportunity to drown him in a cauldron of boiling gruel intended for the kennels. Although all the physical violence here is perpetrated by men, the breastfeeding mother, Anna, is involved as both victim and collaborator in a cycle of abusive management and retribution. So when maternal agency is interrupted, we discover a complete breakdown in the natural order of things and in human relations. Where breastfeeding fails, soon enough, everything collapses. The whole idea of a woman breastfeeding animals was gleefully reproduced in early Soviet propaganda, which reissued the picture you see here as a postcard with a print run of 15,000 copies, just to show how awful and exploitative the old order was. Now I want to turn to the first of my two more detailed case studies, not too much more detailed because I'm only going to talk for about 10 more minutes. So the first of these is by Ivan Ivanovich Lazhechnikov, whom you will know, if you know him, for his book, The Ice House, which made him very famous. But he was also celebrated in his lifetime for his campaign notebooks, which were written during Tsar Alexander I's European campaign against Napoleon, in which Lazhechnikov participated. He published his campaign notebooks in 1820, but as you can see, he was quite long-lived. And he came back in the late 1850s and reissued them with some addenda. And one of these editions was a narrative he wrote in the first person, as if from his own experience, called My Doctor's Grimace, Grimace Moего Doktora, which is set somewhere in Prussia during the campaign and describes an officer, like apparently Lazhechnikov, who is billeted with a Prussian prince and who makes friends with the local doctor, a mysterious figure for two reasons. First of all, the doctor is quite shy and suffers from a disfiguring grimace, a kind of rictus which pulls his face into an unappealing glare, apparently without any control over the action. And the second reason the doctor stands out is that he seems much too well trained and much too cultivated to be the town doctor in an obscure part of Europe. The Lazhechnikov character stays around and asks questions and finally gets to the bottom of the rather sad story. The doctor has a beautiful daughter who lives with him, but whose existence he tries to keep as secret as possible. And this daughter is the product of a marriage the doctor contracted back when he was a celebrated physician specializing in mental illness, practicing in Berlin. At this time, the doctor had been in a position to take in charity patients, and he took in a beautiful young girl who was unable to function normally because she had hysterics whenever she saw anything dirty or out of place, even an object that appeared to be the wrong color. Today, a person with those symptoms would probably be diagnosed with obsessive compulsive disorder. At that time, the doctor's best recourse was to keep her in a situation which was as clean and tidy as possible, so that she would never react negatively to her surroundings. As long as she was kept in such circumstances, the girl seemed happy. The doctor fell in love with her, got her pregnant, and married her in that order, fully conscious that he was acting dishonorably, firstly because he had seduced an innocent girl, and secondly because he knew that she was not fully cured. She was still suffering from her madness, even if the provocation had been removed. Soon enough, their child was born, and this was where everything went wrong for the doctor, his wife, and ultimately for their daughter. Amalia, this is the name of the doctor's wife, had been determined to breastfeed her child, and everything seemed to be going well. But the doctor cannot allow the breastfeeding relationship to develop normally, because he is convinced that the mother's madness will infect the child through the milk. He genuinely believes that insanity is heritable via milk. And this slide tells the story of what happens. The doctor secretly poisons his own child in order to make her appear unwell. Feeling guilty, Amalia decides to stop feeding her daughter, and therefore, as Lazhechnikov tells us, she hastily sacrificed her greatest joy, her happiness. After giving the child to the wet nurse, she fell into a deep depression. Soon, the milk went to her head. Soon after that, she dies, probably of some kind of infection caused by mastitis, which is how I would posthumously diagnose the milk going to her head, which is certainly not an official condition. So the irony is that the daughter grows up to apparently inherit her mother's condition. She too is upset by anything dirty or out of place. However, her reaction is not to go into hysterics, but to show her father's grimace. Her face, which is so beautiful and attractive, twists into an unpleasant expression. The doctor, keen to ascribe his daughter's disorder to her maternal inheritance, fails to consider that this mental illness may originate on his side of the family, or that his own obsession with suppressing female insanity may amount to a compulsive fixation in its own right. In this story, breast milk exemplifies both female autonomy, because, like Tolstoy's Natasha, or indeed Kitty in Anna Karenina, Amalia chooses to feed her own daughter in the teeth of male opposition. Breast milk also stands for matrilineal connection, because maternal love is expressed through the milk and frustrated when the breastfeeding dynamic is interrupted. The doctor, however, with tragic consequences, reconfigures mother's milk as a conduit for insanity, mendaciously assuring his wife that her milk is lethal to their child. By forcing his wife to stop breastfeeding, he silences her. This analogy between creative and lacteous expression has been widely acknowledged in post-structuralist criticism, most famously in the essay by Ellen Cixous, The Laugh of the Medusa, which I referred to at the beginning of this talk, which urged women to write yourself, to return to the body, which has been more than confiscated. Similarly, Julia Kristeva argued that breast milk, like tears, are metaphors of non-speech, a discourse that transcends the spoken word. Lazhechnikov's novella, conversely, depicts a woman, here Amalia, the doctor's wife, whose creativity is silenced by a lifelong misdiagnosis. Treated like a lunatic her entire life, the opportunity to nurse her own child is her last chance of self-expression, both literally and metaphorically. When this too is thwarted, she suffers a fatal depression, just as the milk, stopped from flowing into the baby, turns destructively on its source by going to her head. Amalia's body reacts in the semiotics of milk to psychological violence. In the final part of my talk today, I want to look at a very long novel, which you don't have to read because I read it for you, Natasha Podgorich by Mikhail Voskresenskii, now an almost totally obscure figure. I'm very grateful to a friend and colleague for managing to photocopy the novel in a Russian library some years ago and send me scans of the material. Otherwise, there was no way I could have accessed it. This novel is almost completely forgotten, except in a review from 1859 by Nikolai Dobrolubov, who is mostly dismissive of it as a melodramatic potboiler, but who does praise its emphasis on why we should blame women for the unfortunate situations to which they are condemned by male sexual behavior. Natasha Podgorich describes an illegitimate girl who appears to have a wonderful start in life when she is adopted when she is brought up by a wealthy man. But when her protector dies, her fate goes downhill rapidly, and soon she is living as a servant, completely dependent on the whim of a man who is determined to seduce her. To escape this fate, she marries a kindly serf who, for complicated reasons, says that he will take her away to Moscow as his wife, but he will treat her like a sister. At the time that she marries, she is pregnant with a love child. This is a melodramatic novel, I did warn you. The plot is complicated because poor Natasha has fallen in love and been seduced and abandoned. The love child is born in Moscow, but dies immediately afterwards. And poor Natasha is so ignorant about the situation, not only does she not feel grief for her child, she doesn't even realize why her breasts are filling with milk. She thinks she's dying. She goes to a doctor who reassures her about what is happening and who also tells her that the start of lactation could be the threshold to a new career for her. As a German, he recommends her to some German friends of his as a wet nurse for their youngest child. And this opens up a period of relative economic autonomy for Natasha Podgorich. So she is extremely well treated by the family. She is spoiled. She is looked after. She is brought nice things. She is very much treated like a member of the family. And this passage reminds us that the reader and Natasha are aware that all of this kindness is done only in order not to spoil the milk, and through this to cause harm to the child. In other words, the wet nurse's interests are to follow upon the health of the child. They are not an independent good. But I continue reading from the slide. After all, you don't immediately grasp that you are being minded and spoiled only like cream in a churn, out of fear that it might go sour and cause the masters to do without their coffee. Sometimes you think that in truth, they like you for yourself. And in fact, Natasha is liked for herself, or rather, she is liked for herself as a wet nurse. And in this passage, which I won't read aloud, Natasha is out for a little walk with one of her charges. She is seated with the sleeping child, and some well-dressed young men notice them. As you can see from this text, they admire her not just as an attractive girl, but specifically as a social type, as a pretty wet nurse. This is what they find appealing. You recall this is a romance novel. Sure enough, Natasha falls in love with one of these young men, and she's able to arrange her new career so that she, more or less around her weaning cycle. So after ending her contract with the kind German family when their child weans, she sets herself up as a courtesan with one of these young men as her first long-term relationship. And this is how her career progresses. She is famous as the courtesan who is also a former wet nurse. And so she continues a lonely but financially independent figure until she dies of tuberculosis, which she has to do because stories like this in the 19th century need to end badly. The word kормilica, wet nurse, literally means one who feeds others. Its masculine equivalent, kормilec, is usually understood as a breadwinner. The narrator of Natasha Podgorich who only has a very minor role in the action as Natasha's occasional confidant, comments that motherhood is a great thing. And another character says, had this woman been a mother, she would not have turned out like this, nor would she have ended so badly. But as the reader knows, Natasha was a mother, a role which she ring-fenced emotionally by burying any feelings for her dead child, and in fact by monetizing her own maternal status by working as a wet nurse. Natasha Podgorich is not a particularly good novel, but it is a female Bildungsroman whose flawed central character fails at motherhood, much as other more famous eponymous heroines of the realist era will do. Her undoing is not self-doubt, like Anna Karenina, nor convention, like Hedda Gabler. Instead, Natasha Podgorich's brief period of economic independence is curtailed by her own biology. The maternal body simply cannot provide indefinite financial security in a patriarchal world. And I'm going to move swiftly now to my conclusion. And these are the 4 points that I'd like you to take away today. I find it very interesting that male authors do choose to write about lactation in some level of detail, sometimes even physiological detail, as we saw with Lazhechnikov's reference to what must have been mastitis. Since male authors cannot directly benefit from, reproduce in their own bodies, or in any way experience lactation, that their decision to write about the breastfeeding theme implies that there is empathy going on the part of the author and also the male implied narrator. So my point here is that there is more thinking about women, thinking about how it feels to have a female body, how it feels to inhabit a woman's social role. And this can only be a good thing in 19th century narrative. Similarly, breastfeeding narrative foregrounds female self-expression, pun intended, and it explores potential avenues for female autonomy within 19th century realist fiction. Whether that's autonomy within conventional motherhood, as we saw in the Tolstoy examples, or within wet nursing and independent economic transactions, as we saw with Voskresenski's novel Natasha Podgorich. The points that I made mainly in the first half of this paper were how breastfeeding and wet nursing resonate with and sometimes express deeper cultural anxieties and taboos about female, especially maternal sexuality, about the tensions between urban and rural classes, and also ethnic anxieties, even in many instances, post-colonial identity. And finally, these stories show that women who breastfeed possess varying degrees of agency and, if they choose to wet nurse, even economic freedom, even though this is time limited and can be brought to a premature end. And on that note, it's time for my paper to end, not at all prematurely. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Muireann. Christine Warbeck is going to discuss the paper briefly.
Well, thank you very much for having me, and I'm delighted to be the sobеседник today. My remarks are based on the longer article, so I may point out a few things that Muireann wasn't able to get to. But this is a really original presentation on the depiction of breastfeeding mothers in Russian realist literature. And as Muireann has talked about today, it's not peculiar to Russia, that other countries, European countries, dealt with the topic. But for today's purposes, I am going to underline or underscore some major themes in 19th century Russia that are developed by her work. And there are 4 categories, 4 themes. One's the woman's question, which is particularly appropriate for today. Secondly, the peasant question. Thirdly, indirect and direct violence writ large within Russian society. And lastly, the realities of women's experiences, in this case, in childbearing and breastfeeding. I may not be able to get to all my points, but at least by highlighting these right now, you can start thinking of them. course, the women's question or the woman question was raised by women and men in Imperial Russia beginning in the 1830s and 1840s, as you have the development of a women's press, which encouraged women to write and men to address issues of interest to women. Karolina Pavlova's 1848 novel, to which we had a reference for a talk coming up, A Double Life, highlighted upper-class women's exploitation, as well as independent women's choice and need to lead independent lives by earning a living by the pen, the paintbrush, and other forms of creativity. And of course, the woman question bursts open at the seams in the late 1850s and the 1860s into the 1870s, as women and men are talking about women's rights to education, choice in marriage, to include marriages of convenience without sexual relations, which comes up in Voskresenskii's Natasha Podgorich several years before Chernyshevsky's What's to Be Done. And of course, these fictional marriages were to achieve women's independence. And in extreme cases, we see also women disowning societal norms of marriage and motherhood as sacrifices for revolutionary causes. As we move to the peasant question, which is perhaps an even broader set of issues, we have concern in the 19th century after emancipation, concern during serfdom, but it grows through the 19th century about the exploitation of peasants at all times, and that perhaps here is a model for that peasant life is a model for change, the populist notion that peasants are inherently revolutionary and that they could help change society. At the same time, there is, by the end of the 19th century, a sense of despair that populism was perhaps unrealistic, and that we're seeing rather dark masses who can't really help themselves and need reform. Of course, the great writer Anton Chekhov, a grandson of a former serf, remarked that Russians had been abased by centuries of slavery and fear of freedom. And the sense of serfdom permeates Muireann's paper, that it has really shaped Russian society in a way that is quite different. Later in the century, on the anniversary of the 1861 emancipation, Chekhov noted that peasants and even migrant peasants were still being exploited. And this raises the larger and the big question of violence writ large within Russian society. And if we take a Foucaultian interpretation, then this anxiety and the essence of violence within that society places the burden, the onus on the state for creating coercive structures and norms that are replicated throughout the society. The autocratic, patriarchal, paternal, and coercive state upheld serfdom until it could no longer do so, but then tried to mitigate the impacts of industrialization and modernization and stave off revolution by freezing the peasant commune in place. Muireann's paper expands the definition of indirect symbolic violence to go beyond structural impediments, whether those impediments were economic, social, or ethnic, or a combination thereof. What she does is to include within symbolic violence also psychological violence, when mothers are prevented from making their own nurturing choices. And to that, of course, we can add the denial of other choices about premarital sex, marriage partner, for example, for much of the 19th century, marital separation, protection of their bodies against sexual and physical violence. Of course, women could choose infanticide, but that was a very high price to pay for postnatal birth control. And then finally, Muireann's work demonstrate realities of women's experiences in childbearing and breastfeeding. And I'm running out of time, but just a couple of things that I think would be helpful. in placing some of this in context, and Muireann does this in the paper, but I just want to point out that we have to keep in mind that for much of the 19th century, you have an incredibly high fertility rate among women of all estates. Women typically gave birth 6 to 20 times, although family size was limited by the death of children. The infant mortality rates are extremely high, losing half of their children before the age of 5. And that figure only begins to decline in the early 20th century. In the mid-19th century, fully 80% of babies born to peasant women in the summer did not reach the age of 1. Generally, they couldn't be breastfed because they had to perform such heavy labor. They had poor nutrition. They dealt with thirst and unsanitary water, which led to milk drying up or widespread, terrible mastitis. Babies died of chronic diarrhea and dysentery. During the summer and during much of the year as well, peasant women fed their children through the soska, chewed up bread and gruel and put it in a rag and stuck it in their mouths, terribly unsanitary. And this was done not only by peasants, but by the urban poor, even wealthy merchant families. Breast milk was also supplemented by cow's milk. But the problem here was, and this was also true of upper class women, they used a cow's horn as a bottle, basically put a hole in it, and they put a cow's nipple for the child to suck on, but the milk was often sour or became sour as it stayed in this thing, and the horn bottles were not sanitized. They weren't cleaned. So the probable death rate, we don't know for sure, babies fed that way, was 70%. Wealthy women didn't use they switched from the cow's horn to containers made of silver lined with copper, which were also incredibly toxic. So we've got to keep these things in mind. And you have high female mortality, remember, in birthing, separation of children from their mothers in the serf household. We don't know the frequency of that, but it obviously was traumatic. And among peasant women, obviously, value was placed on the health of working women more than on the child, resulting in women's emotional and moral distancing from newborns as a way to manage frequent death. So I leave you with those things to think about.
Christine, thank you so much for those fascinating and shocking, actually, remarks. I'll give Muireann a chance to respond briefly, and then we'll open it up. And I also just want to let you know that I'm putting in the chat some information that I was asked to put there by a colleague who's seeking panelists for an ACES panel on a topic that's not unrelated to today's talk. So Muireann, would you like to respond?
Well, I just want to thank Christine for her comments. They're harrowing. I did a lot of this research for the longer article, and it's incredible that the human race has survived in Europe, really. I think the situation in Russia was particularly bad, but throughout history, there have been periods in many European countries where, for religious or other reasons, mothers were discouraged from breastfeeding, and infants did not even receive milk. Sometimes they got water with honey or herbs mixed into it. Babies have been fed the most extraordinary concoctions, and it's really tragic that as a race we do this to ourselves. You don't see animals poisoning their infants; they just lactate and feed them. So it's extraordinary. I also found the first half of Christine's response really stimulating, because I think she showed more clearly than I did how the topic of breastfeeding narrative links up to so many social tensions, to violence, and to constant underlying issues like the situation of serfs and of servants. In a way, it's remarkable that there are so few breastfeeding narratives from the 19th century, because the whole whole issue is, well, it's a lightning rod for lots of different problems and concerns.
Thank you. And thank you again, both to our speaker and Sobieседnik. We can open up the floor to questions as we all kind of take in the information we just learned.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm really excited to be here. I have a question about, I guess, literary depictions of the refusal of reproductive labor, like breastfeeding in the 19th century. I'm wondering if you know of any examples of this. Obviously, this is a really complicated question, especially given the information we've been given here in terms of class. And yeah, I say this as somebody who's studying the refusal of work and the racialized and gendered aspects of it, especially in Russian, specifically in Russian literature. And I also just wanted to say, Professor Lansbury, that a lot of your work on Oblomov and also on Tolstoy has informed this. So if you have any thoughts on this, I'd be curious. Thank you.
Thank you. I think there are people here who will know. I mean, I can think of instances of refusal of reproductive labor but only in really highly canonical texts, and I just don't know enough. I can't think outside of those texts off the top of my head, but I will keep thinking about it. It's a really great question. I think Svetlana Grenier has a hand up.
Yes. Well, thank you, Muireann, for a fascinating talk. And I have one just suggestion that might be useful for you, like when you talked about Pamela and the question of, nursing and sexuality. This is also discussed in Georges Sand's Jacques, that novel. It's kind of a big topic there. And so I have a question to you and everybody. Something that I've been struggling with about Anna Karenina, because usually people say that, oh, she didn't nurse and, sort of she chose not to nurse. But there are a couple of places where it says, like when Karenina arrives, and she has her big, conversion kind of thing. She says, like she's kind of raving. He says, дайте мне поскорее воды. Ах, это ей, девочке моей, будет вредно. Ну, хорошо, но дайте ей кормилицу. Ну, я согласна, это даже лучше. Он приедет, ему больно будет видеть ее. Okay, so she's sort of going along with having a кормилица, and then it says then that the daughter would have been neglected if not for Karenin. But then in her conversation with Karenin a little later on, she says, для чего же ты не позволил мне кормить, когда я умоляла об этом? Все равно, она ребенок, и его уморят. Я просила кормить, мне не позволили, а теперь меня же упрекают. So I am never sure, like, should we take this at face value? Who is to blame for Anna not nursing her daughter? So that's my question to you and everyone. What do people think? Maybe Tolstoy is ambivalent about this whole thing.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. I think we met years ago at ACES at a Tolstoy panel that I organized that you gave a paper on. Thank you for your question. I wanted to come back to Ilya's question as well, just to say that in the context, you probably saw my note in the chat, but in the context of Russian literature, I do think it's worth going back to Anna Karenina because it's such a rich text. And I think Svetlana has just underlined that point. Did she refuse to breastfeed or was she prevented? I think by the end of the book, which I was highlighting today, she has definitely moved into refusal mode, in that she has withdrawn from showing interest in breastfeeding, labor, talking about children. She has recused herself. But I would need to go back over those quotations. I suspect she's meant to come across as herself ambivalent and confused and a little bit feverish, and that's why she's raving about how she wanted to breastfeed. I don't think there's any signs of her emotional attachment to that second child. But thank you for your question. It's really interesting to consider. Does anyone else want to come in on that?
I don't have any more examples that are coming to mind, but it might be worth looking in Anna Berman's book about siblings and the structure of Russian families in 19th century fiction. You might get instances. I'm very intrigued by this question you raised about the refusal of reproductive labor, and I can only think of the big instances, Hélène's sort of abortion, or the Spatwitch, the Chekhov story, but I'm sure that there are more that are just not coming to mind.
There's got to be something in Dostoevsky, maybe in Podrostok. That is such a strange novel, and there's so much reproduction going on there. There's got to be somebody refusing reproductive labor.
Yeah. There's also the short Tolstoy story, or unfinished story, Utra Pameshchika. And I guess there's not, and it's all about refusing labor. The whole story is about refusing labor. And I can't remember if there's any sort of refusal of reproductive labor. We have Serenity says, there's a horrifying story by Litkova called Lushka, where a woman passes on all childcare duties to her young child / older sibling. That sounds pertinent. And I just saw a hand up. I think it was Chris Rain.
Yes. Should I go ahead?
Sure.
Okay. I have sort of a comment, and to me, it's really fascinating in the ways in which, and perhaps predictable too, that so much time and effort was spent on trying to take away women's agency. And here is yet another example of this. And if you think about the discourses that developed around working women, particularly middle class, aristocratic women, and, those flaming feminists and all of that kind of thing, in some ways, it's always this attempt to find the place where women are vulnerable and attack it in some way. And the techniques that are used are just always impressive to me, that they never run out of them, And here we have another example of that. And thank you for taking the time to flesh it out so that we can see it for what this is. And we'll read these authors more carefully. And should we find any more discussions of breastfeeding in other works, see them in a different light. So thank you so much. It was very interesting.
Thank you very much, Christine. That's really gratifying. I'm so glad that you enjoyed the paper and that it's given people something to think about. Just circling back to that question of Iliad's yet again, when I was rereading Anna Karenina yet again, so it was fresh in my mind for this paper, I came across something that Anna says when she has that fateful conversation with Dolly about the one where they talk about when Anna is still happy with Vronsky before everything goes downhill, and she's talking about how she uses contraception and so on. She just seems like the really cool, successful woman, and Dolly feels a little bit ground down and ordinary, but nonetheless buoyed by the fact that she has children whom she genuinely loves. And when it comes out that Anna is using contraception, Dolly is, of course, horrified. And Anna says, well, why should I bring children into the world who will be unfortunate, or words to that effect? And that's certainly refusing reproductive labor. We know that Tolstoy doesn't agree with what Anna is saying, but because he gives her the freedom to express her opinion within the narrative, she actually sounds very convincing. exists, and I think it's taken out of context. It's an immensely relevant phrase for what's happening in American reproductive politics right now, particularly that court case in Texas. Admittedly, Tolstoy would be unlikely to side with plaintiffs, but still, it's an incredibly relevant statement of Anna's.
Just one comment on that passage in Anna Karenina. What always blows my mind about that passage is afterwards, so they have the conversation about contraception, and Dolly's appalled. It's not just that she's appalled, it's that she thinks all of civilization is going to fall apart. She says something crazy like that, like the world will come to an end and civilization will crumble if women can make choices about reproduction. So, which is very much in tune with today's right-wing American rhetoric and pro-natalist rhetoric in lots of places. It's just a really stunning passage.
I completely agree. It's so rich, and the title of my book, which I've been working on for so long, has never changed. It's from the Ghana translation of that passage, and it's "Hideous Agonies," because that is the phrase that's how it's translated by Garnet when she's talking about childbirth and the sheer labor of becoming a mother.
Yeah, it's extremely relevant today, these discussions, at least in the US. This is just one anecdote that I'll pass along and then I'll stop. I spent the other night with an old friend who is a physician who works in reproductive healthcare, and she now has to have FBI protection because crazy people with guns stalk her and circle around outside her hospital, because I think they think what Dolly thinks, which is that, everything's going to fall apart if you give women these choices. Sorry, that was a little bit of a conversation dampener. But it's very exciting to see how you're drawing out these themes from the text that we think we know well, and also bringing up all these other texts that, the lesser known novels.
I'd also like to thank Katie Trumpeter for her comment in the chat that I think we might have passed over, which is about the significance of breastfeeding in different cultures. I have to say I found scholarship on ancient Greek motherhood and breastfeeding really interesting and really relevant, because most of the debates we're having now began back then.
Sarah Dickinson.
Hi, thank you so much for that wonderful talk, Muireann. It was fascinating, as always. My question isn't actually about the content of your talk. I just thought maybe I could entice you to say a few words about your maternal studies network so that people who are here and don't know about it could learn something. I think it's a really fantastic initiative, and not just the idea, but the way that you're actually managing it with the newsletters and conferences, and it's really very exciting. Maybe you can tell us more about that.
Thanks very much, Sarah, on two counts. First, for inviting me to speak tonight, and secondly, for reminding me. So yes, I run a Slavic maternity studies network. As I said at the beginning of the talk, I have noticed that maternal studies, first of all, it's pretty isolated within the various disciplines with which it co-joins. And secondly, within Slavic studies, it's incredibly isolated. There's a few scholars working on it, but they don't always find each other. The situation is improving. There's regularly panels at ACES and so on. But I just set up this network. I'm going to paste the link to the website into the chat now. Oh, no, I'm not. Sorry, I pasted the wrong thing. In order to bring scholars together. And so I was lucky enough to get funding specifically to build the network from the UK government. And so therefore, with this funding from 2021 to 2022, I was able to organize talks, not only by Russian writers and scholars, but the network is opened up to everyone from across Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Socialist Republics region. Sorry, it's evening here. I'm getting tired. So just in running it, I've learned so much, particularly about Lithuanian and Hungarian maternal fictions. I found it very inspiring, and I'm hoping to put together an application for a big grant, which will enable me to look at pretty much exactly what we were talking about just now, the connection between literature about maternal experience and runaway populism in developed countries. Because I'm fascinated that the countries or regions that seem to produce the most resonant maternal fictions also seem to be those countries with the biggest problems with populism and conservatism. And I want to explore how all this links up, and I want to look at resonances between literature about childbirth, motherhood, abortion, and so on in Eastern Europe and Russia, and in contemporary North America. So hopefully I'll be able to go forward with an application for a grant to buy me some time to work on this in the coming years. If you would like to join the network, it's not just for literary scholars, it's also for historians, sociologists, legal historians, basically anybody working in the terrain of Slavic and Eastern European maternal studies. So please just send me an email and I will add you to the network, and you will receive irregular emails from me with information about conferences, publications by our members, and anything else that's relevant in the wonderful world of Slavic maternal studies. I'm not sure if Katie has a question, but her hand has been up for a while.
Yes, Katie Trumpener.
Yeah, thanks. So I hope this is relevant. I'm a non-Slavicist or a avocational non-Russian reader. So of course I was initially hoping, maybe there is a translation of the long novel Natalia. Well, no, nothing. Of course not. Anyway, I was just going to say, I've been working for years on nursemaids and modernism, including a lot of reading into Russian and Slavic material, but also thinking about this comparatively. And I guess in case this is of interest or help to anybody, I think in a way you could draw a map of Europe where England, in a way, France and England are the first to go because of Rousseau partly. So basically by 1800, there is no more upper class female nursing at all. And there is, in France, wet nursing, and it actually turns out it's organized by the state. In 19th century France, there's bureaus that are bringing women in from the countryside and sending people out to nurse. Nonetheless, Zola writes a devastating novel about wet nursing as a kind of human abattoir because the nurses' children are dying while they're in Paris. The nurslings are dying. They're existing in terrible conditions, et cetera, et cetera. And, and then in England, there's a sort of reconversion to maternal breastfeeding. But in Spain, there's still wet nursing in the 1970s. So it's extremely variegated in Europe, kind of when things shift over. And I'm really interested in the ways in which the whole way kind of maternal care is organized, has an effect on everything. So one way in which societies stay backwards is, they have the wrong breastfeeding dispensation, if you know what I mean. Anyway, I hope that's just helpful as a way of, to urge the Slavicists to think about, what, if any, are the organizations. Now, it seems to me from the outside that in a way in the 19th century, because of serfdom, it's more like the American South, where there are often servants who are, or serfs who are very physically proximate to the family, living with the family, et cetera, et cetera. So that's a kind of organic situation that's different from the Parisian situation. But it also seems to me that in a way, the memory of serfdom sort of stays with the whole notion of wet nursing and nursing. And so it's there in Hadosevich and in other extremely anxious moments in, late 19th century and early 20th century Russian literature. So the moment when, I think it's in the cherry orchard, they're going to send the nurse away. And it's like this moment of intense sort of moral crisis where then everything is over. All of the bonds of mutual obligation are broken. I also, one last thing about wet nursing. It's interesting when the English conquer Ireland, they are appalled that there is cross nursing going on between aristocratic families as a way of developing an alternative kinship system. And Spencer and others write in disgust and horror about this. But I guess what to me is most illuminating about that is it suggests nursing is potentially a kinship system. It's not, because they argue it's not just blood, but it's milk. And they argue in disgust, you might as well be drinking from Circe's cup if you put the alien breast milk to your own lips. It's you'll be turned into an animal by this disgusting practice. But in some societies, it does have to do with kinship and kinship structure. And so I think, for instance, with Vera Feichner and some of the anarchists, often they have extremely intense relationships to their nurse and attenuated relationships to their biological parents, whom they've learned to hate for various reasons. And they think of this as a kinship relationship, absolutely. And it spurs them politically in really interesting ways. I'm sorry to go on and on about this.
No need to apologize. That was extremely interesting. And it seems like a very rich way to contextualize all this. Christine.
Just as a correction or addition, there were foundling homes in Russia, and they do they are started under Catherine II. David Ratzel has written about it quite extensively. The model is based on French and German practices, and so it's peasant women are allowed to, anyone is allowed to drop children that they cannot sustain off at the home, and then you have the booklet, milk booklet. Women go to St. Petersburg initially, and then Moscow and other places to pick up children. The death rate is horrific. So there is this corollary that is outside the practices of the upper classes, and they continue through the 19th century. The mortality rate, and often women who pick up these babies, they take several of them, they dispense them. We don't know how, some don't live. Some of the women who take on the children who are paid may not even be able to breastfeed. We just don't have enough information, but the mortality rates are so high. It changes for the better in the 1890s when a law is put in that an infant must stay with the maternal mother for a certain amount of time before a foundling home would accept the child.
Well, this has been an incredibly rich and, to me, enlightening conversation. And I'm definitely going to send my email address to Muireann and get put on the maternal studies list. So thank you both for these remarks, and thank you to everyone who contributed. I know that Muireann has an appointment at 1:30, so I think we'll wrap it up. I like Katie Trumpeter's last remark that Bottle salutes the new maternal home as the harbinger of the new state. Well, of course he does. Oof. But thank you very much. Yeah, I think there'd be a lot. I mean, if you look at sort of the whole Soviet discourse of Radom, you'd find a lot of and Dietom, you'd find a lot of things like that. So thank you so much to everybody. Much appreciated. Bye.
Can I please thank you, Anne, and for chairing, and Christine for being a wonderful subversive, and Sarah for inviting me in the first place. So thank you to everybody for coming along, and to all of you for your questions. Any more about Dietom and so on, I'd love to hear about, so please email me. I actually have that Babel story in my book, but please hit me up with more information.
Okay.
So thank you all, and с праздником once again.
С праздником.